Happy release day, everybody. Duskmourn just dropped, and so I thought I'd give you a look at some of the decks that I've been brewing up in anticipation of the release. So this one is Azorius Mentor, and could also call it Oculus Mentor. The only Duskmourn card that is new here is the Abhorrent Oculus, and I think this could fit nicely into the archetype. One, it's less than 3, which the mana value is less than 3, or 3 or less, so it works with the Helping Hand, which allows you to return a creature with value 3 or less, which then allows you to get around the casting cost of this, of exiling your graveyard. But this deck does relatively well at filling its own graveyard and benefits off of the mill from like Picklock, Prankster, the Sleight of Hand, and Moment of Truth. I guess this one actually doesn't put it into the graveyard, but then it helps you also through the new mechanic of Manifesting Dread. You put one card onto the battlefield, and then you put one card into your graveyard. And so it further helps you with like increasing the power of your Haughty Djinn. Now, some builds I've seen exploring doing this archetype have ditched the Haughty Djinn for the Oculus, and I want to try running both because I think putting an additional threat into this archetype could work. And the downside, I think, to this is that there's not a whole lot of spells that this is really going to benefit. It does make your Soul Partition 1 cheaper and your Moment of Truth 1 cheaper, and I decided to go with No More Lies, and if you wanted to make the Djinn a little bit better, you could go with a different counterspell like Confounding Riddle, 3 Steps Ahead, the Phantom Interference. The reason why I went away from the 3 Steps Ahead was because it's the one double pip blue for the cancel is kind of hard to do in a 2-color archetype. So if you're going to do the cancel, I really want the blue count on turn 3 to be like 15. And this one does have enough blue, so you could, if you want to do that. But I think that the No More Lies is a benefit to being in the white-blue archetype, and makes it a little bit better than some of the alternatives. The other Reasonable Doubt could work as well. So the general plan, if you're not familiar with this, maybe I should have started there, is Monastery Mentor, being able to create 1/1s every time that you cast a spell, and lots of really just cheap spells that you can then use to cycle through your deck, make your Mentor really big, and then Djinn discounting those spells and becoming a large flying threat as well. So Into the Floodmaw here I included because I like to build for best of 1, and I think that Into the Floodmaw is a nice tool against mono red. Sleight of Hand then helps you find the right... a lot of times early on too, Sleight of Hand increases your spell count in your graveyard and helps you find additional lands, which allows you to run a lower land count than you normally would. So this one is coming in at 20, and so is leaning really into that low part of the mana curve. Picklock, Prankster for the mill, Soul Partition as well for the Into the Floodmaw, kind of like stall until we can kind of overwhelm them with our tempo strategy. So No More Lies here is less about disrupting an opponent's threat, and more to be a response to temporary lockdown or Sunfall or some sort of sweeper that this deck can struggle against. As far as the sideboard options go, I thought Surge of Salvation could also be a useful one. It helps you prevent against the black and red sweepers. We do see Pyroclasm making it back into the standard, so that will be a problem for the Monastery Mentor. Not necessarily a problem outside of that. I already talked about the counter spells. Shore Up could be another one. That's if you're coming up against a lot of spot removal. This could be a good one to bring in to protect your Djinn from targets, as well as like protect your Monastery Mentor. And then if we Recommission is another one that we could bring in that kind of gives us an additional helping hand. So if we're feeling like 4 isn't quite enough here, we could bring in additional copies of Recommission. And then Chart a Course is another one that works with the Djinn that kind of helps filter along with like the Moment of Truth or the Sleight of Hand that you see sometimes in this archetype. And this allows you to discard a card to help further fill the graveyard, getting you 2 spells into the graveyard. But because we're kind of ditching the Tolarian Terror and not caring too much about the ultimate spell count in the graveyard outside of the Djinn, I don't think we need to go fully into that strategy. So let me know in the comments below what you think. Always love hearing back from you guys, and I promise some of the other ones will have more than just one Duskmourn card. For example, let's go with the one that I have no idea if this will actually be a competitive archetype, but I think it looks appealing, right? So as I mentioned, Pyroclasm has rotated back into standard with Duskmourn, and this looks particularly nice, I think, against the Selesnya Rabbits and the Rakdos Lizards. So I do think that we're going to see this at least as a tech card in Best of 3. Hard to say if it's actually going to be worth running in Best of 1, but I'm definitely going to try it out. We also have the Disruption of Torch the Tower, nothing new there. Gives us the instant speed to answer Slickshot Show-Offs, which have been performing quite well prior to the release. Brotherhood's End gives us a slightly larger Wrath than the Pyroclasm, and might be overkill to be running all of these. This card, though, is going to be a top performer with Rooms, because it deals X damage where X is the greatest mana value among cards that you discarded, and the mana value of the cards that you discard of the Rooms are their combined. So, like, for example, this one here would be 7, right? So, as I mentioned in my video for the pre-release guide, the mana value of it once it's in play, there's like some weird rules that involve this, but while you're discarding it from your hand, it makes Ill-Timed Explosion do an incredible amount of damage. So I think that this is going to work particularly well. So we just disrupt their plays if they're too fast for us to deal with before we get into just repeatedly wrathing the board, and then we just win through room synergies. So the Promising Staircase, see if I can find it, not the Meat Locker, here it is, Promising Stairs. So at the beginning of your upkeep, you win the game if there are 8 or more different names among unlocked doors of rooms you control. So each room has 2 doors, so you only need to have 4 completed rooms for you to just win the game. And they do have to be different, though. So Smoky Lounge, the other side of it too, you get to search to find more rooms, gives you some good card draw. Smoky Lounge also gives you like ramp into it, and then some creatures to fill the board. The Roaring Furnace is another way to kind of like the blue-red one, Fires of Victory, right? Dealing damage equal to the number of cards that are in your hand. And then the 5th one is actually really great for just continuous card draw the longer that the game goes. So this is a control archetype, and so it is running 26 lands to ensure that we don't stumble on any mana, because this deck is never going to be it's never going to run out of options of things to do with its mana between unlocking all of the doors. So Meat Locker gives us the ability to stun, tempo, and stall into our Wrath, and then also gives us Dig later. And then the Glassworks, 4 damage to target creature, and then 1 damage to each opponent repeatedly. So just totally win through room strategy. Really excited to try this one out and see how it goes once I've collected some of these rooms. So I think the weakest thing that this deck is going to have to do, or the hardest matchup for this deck, is going to be counterspells. Anything that can kind of disrupt the win conditions of the deck, I feel like that could be a problem. And so I really think that we'll probably need to bring in some form of negate, reasonable doubt, 3 steps ahead, something like that, if we start to see more counterspells in the meta. Right now, Best of 1 has not had a whole lot of control outside of like Domain doing Sunfall, and so I don't think that we will need to start there, but Negate could be another option as well. And then Deduce is one that I've seen like in Croaky's room deck. I think they were running Deduce, and so this could help us get like further dig if we're not feeling like we're getting through our library well enough, which this deck could struggle a little bit with, because the things that allow us to kind of draw into our cards are later in the game. So a little bit earlier could help us find that Wrath if we need to cast our Brotherhood's End on turn 3. And Fires of Victory is another one that we could bring in if we need more instant speed interaction for like the slick shot show-offs, if the 4 copies of Torch the Tower is not really quite cutting it. Orzhov Discard, too, I think got some interesting cards from Duskmourn. So we've got the Toby, Beastie Befriender, which definitely wants to be in a Blink deck. And there are some Azorius builds that are trying to do it, and I just don't think they're quite there in comparison to the value that we're getting out of black, right? And so I based this one off of Cabeza de Bolo's build. I really like the braids inclusion with the carrot cake. I think that it plays really well. And this deck is already looking to either replay their cards off of something like Nurturing Pixie, but also Guardian of Ghirapur. So it kind of gives us a different or a cheaper alternative to Beza that's going to give us more threats to close out the game. I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to be better than Beza, but it is a rare instead of a mythic, so it could give some people some alternative strategies to explore. Zoraline is able to reanimate anything in this deck because it's all mana value 3 or less. And we also got Nowhere to Run, which is an enchantment that we could be playing instead of the Tithing Blade, but the Nowhere to Run doesn't work quite as well with the Guardian of Ghirapur because this one can blink artifacts but not enchantments. Still think it's an interesting one to explore, especially because it gets around like the hexproof and things like that. So could still be an interesting one. You can pick it up with the Nurturing Pixie, so I think we'll see people at least exploring it in this archetype. Then we've got, the typical just like Tithing Blades that you can rebounce, Hopeless Nightmare to attack their hand, Carrot Cake for life stabilization, as well as Fodder to sacrifice to our Braids for value, and Novice Inspector to also give us artifact fodder for Braids. And can't remember off the top of my head, 23 lands on this one feels about right. I've seen even a little bit higher than that because of having to recast your stuff. Can actually make this deck a little bit more expensive than it looks. And there were so many options to think about in this one that the sideboard is still a little out of control. I usually try to whittle it down a little bit, but Orzhov Discard is really not figured out, in my opinion. And there's a lot of things that are already like being explored right now with like, we saw a lot of enchantment exploration in the tournament in Japan for the championship, blanking on the name of it, and Corpses of the Lost, which also synergizes with Braids being able to sacrifice the tutor. And so we've got some interesting ways of going about the archetype that is more enchantment heavy, which then fits better with the Nowhere to Run and worse with the Guardian of Ghirapur, right? So if you want to lean more into the full-blown enchantment build, I do think there's a path here with Victor Valgovoth's Cynical. And specifically, whenever an enchantment you control enters, it surveils and then discards, which fits into the Orzhov Discard theme. And then you can do a Reanimator strategy, which could work well with like the Overlord of the Baelmerk that we got in Duskmourn as well. Beza is an alternative that is typically included. That these are common inclusions. Like the Witch's Vanity gives us some more fodder. Beza, the Bounding Spring, gives us some life stabilization. Go for the Throat and Cut Down and the Bat, Deep Cavern Bat, are all worthy things to explore for sure. But yeah, the enchantment specific one I think is an interesting route to go about as well. So Lorn of the Third Path gives us some artifact and enchantment hate, usually better in best of 3 than it is in best of 1, where you see more of the Boros control build that's running the Caretaker's Talent. And then Bandit's Talent, if you want to lean fully into the hand hate, you could bring in stuff like the Thoughtstalker Warlock and even the the 4-cost guy that I'm blanking on that creates a clue token. Liliana of the Veil, too. We see this one in this archetype quite a bit that fits into the discard theme and can kind of further hate on control. It has some bad matchups, which is why I don't really want to include it for best of 1. Rottenmouth Viper is another one that if you are going to ditch the Guardian of Ghirapur and go more into the fodder route with the Witch's Vanity and the Case of the Stashed Skeleton and the Corpses of the Lost kind of build, I think that the Rottenmouth Viper would probably be a good inclusion in that one instead of the Guardian of the Ghirapur. Shieldred gives us some stabilization against mono red with the card draw, but then does also increase kind of having to hit turn 4 on the lands. And Spiteful Hexmage, I've seen some people exploring this one as well because of being able to sacrifice the enchantment to Braids. So Spiteful Hexmage specifically works well with Braids. I think if you lean even further into the Braids synergies, that you'd probably want to bump it up to 4. But whenever I start testing a deck, I always like to start it out with just the legendaries at 3 copies. And then Get Lost is another one that if we're in the black-white space, I think this one gives us a pretty good way to hit several different threats. And yeah, so that's Orzhov Discard. The fourth one here is Selesnya Counters. And I haven't quite gotten this deck to work, to be honest. And I've been trying to because I really like the archetype, and I do think that there is something there. The biggest problem is trying to figure out an answer to Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall, right? Because this deck does not do very well with sweepers, but it's worth exploring, right? So we've got a lot of cards that give us the +1/+1 counters that move to other creatures even, and we've further got even more of that with the Reluctant Role model. So we're able to put a +1/+1 counter or flying or lifelink, and then whenever it or another creature you control dies, if it had counters on it, you put it onto another creature. And so you can kind of do this if you're getting attacked by single point interaction, you can then have your counters be moving to these additional threats that you're playing. Ozolith then doubles all of the counters that are being created, and Bristly Bill has the ability to double those counters as well for a later late game mana sink. And Dusk Legion Duelist gives us a card draw every time that it's targeted, and you do have the Bristly Bill for the landfall to put a +1/+1 counter on it, as well as the Siege Veteran. That might be overkill, because Siege Veteran has been kind of a little bit too slow with the Sunfalls specifically. But I really like the combination of the Tumblewag and the Hydra. So the Goldvein Hydra coming in with X +1/+1 counters on it, and then you can put additional counters and double those counters and make the Hydra into an absolutely huge threat that then gives us all of the mana that we could possibly need if it ever dies. And then Kutzil, the Exemplar here, gives you more card draw, which, since we're not going to be running the Knight Errant of Eos like we're seeing with like Selesnya Rabbits and Boros Convoke, I think that what I'm going to try to do is answer the Sunfalls by card drawing into additional threats. And like I said, I'm still not 100% sure that it's going to work, because really the only new card that we're getting is the Reluctant Role model, and I'm not sure that this is enough to put it over the top. But Lifelink is definitely nothing to scoff at, and I think that, yeah, so it's close to being a competitive archetype. It's just not quite there. We just really need a better answer for the sweepers. That being said, I do think there's some other options that we have that could be explored that are old options, so I'll just go through them really quickly. I wanted this to be a majority green deck instead of a majority white deck, so if we want to lean more towards white, the benefit would be we could play the Enduring Bond Warden on turn 1, and we could play the Boonbringer Valkyrie. The double pip white is kind of difficult to do in a 2-color space without leaning more directly into being majority white. So, but this could also give us some stabilization, similar to the Reluctant Role model, that could help up against the early aggro. Titania's Command, you can put counters on creatures you control, as well as give Graveyard Hate, which could be relevant with like Reanimators, and the Manifest Dread I think is going to create even more Graveyard archetypes. So this, the problem is it's turn 6 when you can finally start attacking their Graveyard. So probably not as relevant as I would like it to be. Case of the Trampled Garden is another way that like can get trample to push through. So outside of the Hydra, our really big creatures could just end up getting chump blocked, and that could be a problem against Boros Convoke. So being able to bring in something that can give us that trample is a nice way to push the damage through. Same with Storm the Seed Core, gives us the +1/+1 counters and then Vigilance and Trample on all of our creatures. Snakeskin Veil puts a counter on and gives it a hexproof. It could be useful to bring in. This is a very creature-centric build. The only non-creature is the Ozolith. So we may need to bring some of this in. I don't think this is going to struggle as much against single-point interaction because we have like the Paw Patch Recruit and such. But it could struggle in theory, so always good to keep in mind. The Clay Champion, I think, works well into this archetype, fits the counters theme, and could be a good exploration. The downside is that you'd have to go further up the curve, which makes it then more prone to Sunfall. Simian Simulacrum as well with the Unearth ability. Unearth, not super great if your card is getting exiled. Kami of Whispered Hopes could work as far as like ramping into the more expensive threats. So if you did want to bring in some of the later stuff, then maybe Kami would be a good one to explore. Botanical Brawler is one too that I know some people really love. It would give the deck more trample, and it gives you kind of that doubling effect of you put a +1/+1 counter on like your Duelist, and then you're also getting a +1/+1 counter on the Brawler. It can be a little bit hard since this is leaning more towards green than it is an equal split. It would be a little bit harder to cast the green-white, which I really want 14 sources of white and 14 sources of green for Botanical Brawler, and this one's at 13 white. So if I did bring it in, I'd probably tweak that up one. Get Lost and Destroy Evil, I think, kind of helps the deck have an answer for Temporary Lockdown. And yeah, like I mentioned, probably bring this in if I wanted to go more of the white direction. So I hope that gives you some ideas to explore. And we got one more coming on the down the line. Last but not least is Simic Dread, and I think especially with the ability of the Shrieker to just be able to cheaply turn down your face down permanents, that people are going to be trying to maximize how to make the Shrieker really perform, because it has some pretty crazy potential, and it's not, you know, it's a 3/3 for one double pip green, so it, the double pip green, then again, though, you do want to have the 15 sources of green, so it can be a little burdensome on the mana. The nice thing about this, though, is that we can play the Restless Vinestalk and like the tap lands, Hedge Maze, and things like that, because we're not really trying to play anything on turn 1. The Sleep Cursed Fairy is in here, not really to play on turn 1, but more that we can flip it up and avoid having the stun counters. So if it's a way to just cheaply get a 3/3 flyer in. Kind of excited to explore this one, honestly, see if it's worth doing. Because like we don't even need to flip it up with Shrieker, right? Like once it's cloaked or Manifest Dread on the battlefield or whatever, like we can flip the Sleep Cursed Fairy up relatively easily, and then it avoids the enter trigger and is just a 3/3 flyer. So I think this increases the tempo of the deck. We've got the Valgavoth's Onslaught, which allows us to have a payoff similar to like Doppelgang, but fitting into the face down strategy of Manifest Dread. And Vannifar being able to put a +1/+1 counter on our colorless creatures. All of the Manifest Dreads are still colorless creatures, so anything that is doing the Manifest Dread, I think, works particularly well with Vannifar. We also have Hide in Plain Sight, which allows us to further lean into the cloak synergies. We have the Cryptic Coat, which is difficult for control decks to deal with because of its ability to be a recurring threat. And then I thought we'd put in some Disruption, because Simic doesn't interact particularly well. The downside to the archetype is that it's limited to cards like Hard-Hitting Question, and but the Repulsive Mutation, I think, could work particularly well in Simic. I would like to see this card find a home. And the Reasonable Doubt, I think, works well here for not being... We have enough blue that we could do 3 steps ahead, so this one, you'd also have to play around with it. But again, similar to the other one, I'm looking to block a Sunfall later in the game, because like we manifest this giant board of colorless creatures and then they wipe the board. So Reasonable Doubt works pretty well for counterspelling the Sweeper. And then we've got the Oblivious Bookworm. I think this is going to be a really great performing uncommon, at least in Limited. We'll see if it's got enough sauce for Constructed. But this one allows us to give us some really great dig and find, could just be card draw at the beginning of your in-step every turn if you're able to manifest well enough, which I think this deck has the potential to do. This deck is leaning a little bit more into cloaked synergies than it is strictly into the Manifest Dread, but it's whenever a permanent is turned face up, so the cloaked works with it as well. Alternatives, yeah, if we need more interaction, there's definitely some options. Into the Flood Maw, like I mentioned, is particularly good against mono red, being able to target whatever they're targeting with their spell and bounce it back to their hand. Splash Portal could be an interesting one. I like this one more if we're going to lean further down the line. Like Overlord of the Haunt Woods allows us to ramp, works well with the Onslaught strategy. If we're going to go down that route and put in bigger threats that we're trying to get face down and then turn up cheaply with Shrieker, then we could bring in the the 6/6 that the 6/6 dinosaur, and you know, we could bring in some bigger green threats like the silverback, that we could then like aim to flip over cheaply. And Splash Portal works for that, because if you blink something that's face down, when it comes back into play, it'll be face up. So it's a way to cheaply flip things over, as well as the Shrieker. One thing to consider if you go that route. I don't think this build will need it, but time will tell. And I think Artifact and Enchantment Hate is at least worth mentioning, especially in Best of 3. I think it's a little less relevant in Best of 1. Depends on where you are in the ladder, but this one I think could work as well. And then if they don't have an Artifact or an Enchantment, then you can just use it to manifest Dread, which is not the end of the world. So I hope you enjoyed yourself. Let me know in the comments below which one you're most excited to try out, and which one looks like a complete disaster. And I'll be back to talk later this week. So by Monday, I'll be doing my Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review like I have been doing. For those who were curious, my little vacation was wonderful. I had a great time. And but I am happy to get back to talking about Magic. And so we'll be talking about the first week's top performers on Monday. And if there's something that, you know, catches my interest or my eye prior to that, I will do my best to showcase that from the early data of week 0 of Duskmourn. So thanks for listening to my ramblings as always. Take care, everybody, and I will see you all on Monday.